Imagine if every country on Earth suddenly became obsessed with one thing. Not technology, not productivity, not innovation, not education, not businesses, just gold. Governments would spend enormous amounts of money trying to collect it. Wars would be fought over it. Trade policies would be built around it. Entire empires would be created to acquire more of it. As strange as that sounds today, this was basically how much of Europe thought about wealth for centuries. And according to Adam Smith, it was one of the biggest economic mistakes in history. Welcome to Book 4 of The Wealth of Nations. This is where Smith stops asking how wealth is created and starts asking a different question. Why do governments get economics so wrong? And to answer that question, he takes aim at the dominant economic theory of his time, a theory called mercantilism. The idea everyone believed. To understand why Smith was so revolutionary, you have to understand the world he lived in. In the 1700s, most European governments shared a common belief. The richer a nation was in gold and silver, the richer the nation itself was. Simple. If gold equals wealth, then the goal of economic policy becomes obvious. Get more gold. Keep the gold you already have. Stop gold from leaving the country. Everything else becomes secondary. Today this sounds strange, but at the time it seemed perfectly logical. Gold was valuable. Silver was valuable. Kings stored them in vaults. Armies were financed with them. International trade often used them, so governments naturally concluded more gold equals more national wealth. That assumption shaped economic policy for centuries. The global treasure hunt. Once governments accepted this idea, they began acting accordingly. Countries competed to accumulate precious metals. They searched for gold mines. They searched for silver mines. They established colonies overseas. They fought wars. They built massive trading networks. They passed laws designed to keep wealth flowing into the country. Europe became involved in what was essentially a giant treasure hunt. From the government's perspective, international trade looked like a competition. If one country gained wealth, another country must have lost it. Trade was viewed almost like a sporting event. Someone wins, someone loses, someone takes home the prize, and the prize was gold. Why governments loved exports. This thinking created another idea that became incredibly popular. Exports are good, imports are bad. Why? Because exports bring money into the country. Imports send money out. At least that's how people saw it. Governments wanted to sell as much as possible to foreign countries while buying as little as possible from them. This became known as maintaining a favorable balance of trade. If more money came in than went out, the country supposedly became richer. As a result, governments introduced all kinds of policies: import restrictions, trade barriers, special privileges, monopolies, subsidies, protective tariffs. The goal was always the same: keep wealth inside the country. It sounds reasonable. Here's what makes mercantilism interesting. It doesn't sound completely crazy. In fact, many people today still think this way. You often hear statements like, "We're losing money to other countries. They're taking our jobs. We import too much. We need to stop buying foreign products." These arguments sound familiar because they're based on the same basic assumptions that dominated Europe during Smith's time. That's why Book 4 feels surprisingly modern. Many of the debates Smith was having in 1776 are still happening today. Different countries, different industries, same arguments. Adam Smith sees a problem. Smith looked at the mercantilist system and saw something most people were missing. He asked a simple question: what is wealth really? Think about it. Imagine a country has enormous piles of gold, mountains of it, vaults packed with precious metals, but the country struggles to produce food. Its factories barely operate, its roads are falling apart, its people lack basic necessities. Would you call that country wealthy? Probably not. Now imagine another country. It has less gold, but it produces abundant food, builds useful products, develops new technologies, creates businesses, employs millions of workers, provides a high standard of living. Which country is actually richer? Smith believed the answer was obvious. Real wealth is not gold. Real wealth is productive capacity. The missing piece. This was the insight that changed economics. Mercantilists focused on money. Smith focused on production. Mercantilists looked at treasure. Smith looked at output. Mercantilists asked, "How much gold do we have?" Smith asked, "What can we produce?" Because at the end of the day, people don't consume gold. They consume goods and services, food, housing, transportation, clothing, healthcare, tools, technology, entertainment. What matters is the ability of an economy to produce the things people actually need and want. That's where wealth comes from, not from storing metal in a vault. The dangerous consequences. The problem wasn't just that mercantilism misunderstood wealth. The problem was that bad ideas create bad policies. If governments believe gold is wealth, they start chasing gold. If governments believe imports are harmful, they restrict trade. If governments believe economic activity must be tightly controlled, they interfere with markets. Over time, these policies can reduce efficiency, reduce competition, reduce innovation, and ultimately reduce prosperity. Smith believed many governments were unintentionally making their nations poorer while trying to make them richer. That's a powerful argument, and a controversial one. A radical new way of thinking. What made Adam Smith different was that he shifted attention away from government treasure chests and toward ordinary economic activity. Farmers growing crops, workers making products, merchants conducting trade, entrepreneurs starting businesses, consumers making choices. These activities create wealth, not piles of gold, not political control, not colonial expansion, not government restrictions. This idea seems obvious today because Smith's influence became so widespread. But in the 18th century, it challenged centuries of conventional wisdom. Why this matters today? One reason the wealth of nations remains relevant is that the underlying question never disappears. What actually makes a nation prosperous? Is it money, natural resources, political power, trade surpluses, government control, or is it something else? Smith's answer is surprisingly simple. A nation becomes wealthy when it becomes productive, when it creates value, when people are free to innovate, invest, trade, and improve their lives. That idea forms the foundation of everything that follows in Book 4. The bigger lesson. Book 4 begins with a myth, the myth that national wealth comes from accumulating gold and silver. Adam Smith believes this myth led governments down the wrong path for generations, and over the next several chapters, he's going to dismantle that entire way of thinking piece by piece. Because if gold isn't wealth, then what is? If imports aren't necessarily harmful, then why do governments fear them? And if markets can coordinate economic activity better than politicians expect, what role should government actually play? Those questions lead directly into one of the most famous arguments in economic history, an argument that starts with a simple but revolutionary claim. Gold does not make a nation rich. Wealth comes from production. Imagine you're stranded in the middle of a desert. The sun is blazing. You've been walking for hours. You're dehydrated. exhausted, desperate. Then someone gives you a choice, a chest filled with gold or a bottle of water. Which one are you taking? The answer is obvious: the water. Not because gold suddenly became worthless, but because value depends on what people actually need. And this simple idea sits at the heart of one of Adam Smith's most important arguments in The Wealth of Nations. In Book 4, Smith attacks the belief that dominated Europe for centuries: the idea that gold and silver are the true measures of national wealth. According to Adam Smith, this belief confused money with wealth itself, and that mistake led governments to pursue the wrong goals. Money is not the same as wealth. Think about your own life. If someone asked whether you're wealthy, would you simply count the cash in your wallet? Probably not. You'd think about much more than that: your income, your house, your skills, your investments, your ability to earn money in the future, your overall standard of living. In other words, wealth is bigger than money. Smith argued that nations work the same way. A country's wealth is not determined by how much gold it owns. It's determined by its ability to produce goods and services that improve people's lives: food, clothing, housing, tools, machines, transportation, technology, healthcare. These things create real prosperity. Gold merely facilitates exchange. The illusion of wealth. Imagine two countries. Country A owns enormous reserves of gold. Its vaults are overflowing, but its farms are inefficient. Its factories barely operate. Its infrastructure is crumbling. Its economy produces very little. Country B owns far less gold, but its farms are productive. Its businesses are innovative. Its factories manufacture valuable products. Its workers are highly skilled. Which country would you rather live in? Most people would choose country B immediately, because what matters is not how much gold exists. What matters is what the economy can actually produce. This was the distinction Smith wanted people to understand. Money is useful. Production is essential. Gold cannot feed anyone. One of Smith's strongest points is surprisingly simple. You can't eat gold. You can't wear gold as clothing. You can't live inside a pile of gold. You can't build an economy merely by accumulating precious metals. At some point, people need actual goods and services. Imagine a nation with unlimited gold but no farmers. Eventually, people starve. Imagine a nation with unlimited gold but no builders. Eventually, housing becomes scarce. Imagine a nation with unlimited gold but no manufacturers. Eventually, shortages appear everywhere. Production is what sustains society, not the money itself. Why governments got confused? To be fair, Smith understood why governments became obsessed with gold. Gold was valuable. It was widely accepted. It was used in international trade. It financed governments and armies. It looked like wealth. And because it looked like wealth, many leaders assumed it was wealth. This is a mistake people still make today. Sometimes people confuse symbols of success with success itself. A luxury car is not financial security. A large salary is not necessarily wealth. A rising stock price is not always a healthy business. Likewise, a pile of gold is not the same thing as a productive economy. Smith constantly pushes readers to look beneath appearances. The real source of prosperity. So if gold isn't wealth, then what is? Smith's answer remains one of the foundations of modern economics. The wealth of a nation comes from its productive capacity, its ability to create valuable goods and services, its ability to satisfy human wants and needs, its ability to improve living standards. This depends on productive workers, efficient businesses, investment, specialization, innovation, trade, and infrastructure. These are the engines of prosperity. Gold is merely a tool that helps coordinate economic activity. Why production matters more than resources. This insight helps explain something interesting about the modern world. Some countries possess enormous natural resources, but remain relatively poor. Others possess few natural resources, but become incredibly wealthy. Why? Because resources alone do not create prosperity. What matters is how effectively a society uses its resources. Consider places like Japan or Singapore. Neither became wealthy simply because of vast gold reserves. They developed through productivity, industry, technology, trade, and human capital. Smith's framework helps explain why. The productivity revolution. Throughout history, the countries that became richest were usually not the ones with the most treasure. They were often the ones that increased productivity the fastest. The Industrial Revolution provides a perfect example. Factories increased output, machines multiplied human effort, transportation improved, production exploded, living standards gradually rose. The source of this wealth wasn't gold. It was productivity, the ability to create more value using the same amount of labor and resources. This is why Smith cared so much about specialization and capital investment in the earlier books. Those forces increase productive capacity, and productive capacity creates wealth. What happens when governments chase the wrong goal? Smith worried that governments focusing on gold often ignored the real drivers of prosperity. Instead of encouraging production, they chased treasure. Instead of promoting efficiency, they restricted trade. Instead of increasing competition, they protected favored industries. The result was often slower growth. Because when policymakers misunderstand the source of wealth, they risk creating policies that weaken the economy. A nation becomes richer by producing more value, not by obsessing over how much money sits in its vaults. Why this lesson still matters. More than 250 years later, Smith's warning remains relevant. People still confuse money with wealth. Companies sometimes focus on short-term financial appearances rather than long-term value creation. Governments sometimes celebrate financial metrics while ignoring productivity. Individuals sometimes chase symbols of success instead of building real assets and skills. The lesson is timeless. Money is important, but money is not the ultimate goal. The goal is production, value creation, and rising living standards. The bigger lesson. Adam Smith's attack on gold wasn't really about precious metals. It was about how people think. He wanted readers to stop focusing on symbols and start focusing on fundamentals. A nation's strength comes from what its people can create. Its farms, its factories, its businesses, its workers, its innovations, its productive capacity. That's the real wealth of nations. And once Smith establishes this idea, he's ready to challenge another major pillar of mercantilist thinking. Because if gold isn't wealth, then perhaps imports aren't the enemy either. That question leads directly into one of the biggest debates in economics. Should governments restrict trade, or should markets be free to choose? Imagine walking into a grocery store and discovering that half the products are missing. No imported fruit, no foreign coffee, no electronics from overseas, no affordable clothing from other countries. The shelves are emptier, prices are higher, choices are limited. Most people would immediately ask, why would anyone want this? Yet for centuries, many governments intentionally created situations like this. They restricted imports, raised tariffs, protected domestic industries, limited foreign competition, and they believed these policies would make their nations richer. In Book 4 of The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith challenges this idea head-on. He argues that trade restrictions often create the exact opposite of what governments intend. Instead of increasing prosperity, they frequently reduce it. Why governments feared imports. To understand Smith's argument, we need to understand the logic of his opponents. Under the mercantilist mindset, trade was viewed like a competition. If another country sold products to you, they gained money. If you bought products from them, you lost money. Therefore, imports looked dangerous. Governments worried that foreign goods would drain wealth from the country. As a result, they introduced policies designed to discourage imports. Tariffs, quotas, import bans, special taxes, licensing requirements. The goal was simple: buy domestic, avoid foreign products, keep money at home. At first glance, this sounds reasonable, but Smith believed there was a major flaw in this reasoning. Trade is not a war. One of Smith's most important insights is that trade is not a battle. It's not a situation where one side wins and the other loses. Think about what happens when you buy something. Suppose you purchase a sandwich. You give money to the restaurant gives you food. Did you lose? No. You wanted the sandwich, the restaurant wanted the money. Both sides benefited. Otherwise, the transaction wouldn't happen. Smith believed international trade works the same way. When two countries trade voluntarily, both expect to gain something they value more. Trade is not necessarily a zero-sum game. It can create value for both sides. This idea was revolutionary because it challenged the entire mercantilist worldview. What tariffs actually do. Let's imagine a government places a large tariff on imported shoes. The goal is to protect domestic shoe manufacturers. At first, this seems helpful. Foreign shoes become more expensive, domestic producers face less competition, local factories may sell more products. Politicians celebrate, problem solved. Or is it? Smith asks a deeper question. Who pays the tariff? Consumers do. The public now faces higher prices. People spend more money for the same products. Their purchasing power falls. And because consumers have less money left over, they buy fewer other goods and services. The costs are spread across millions of people. The benefits are concentrated among a smaller group of producers. Competition makes businesses better. Another reason Smith disliked trade restrictions is that they reduce competition. Competition can be uncomfortable. Businesses prefer protection. Nobody enjoys fighting for customers. But competition creates pressure to improve. Better products, lower prices, greater efficiency, more innovation. When foreign competitors enter a market, domestic firms often have two choices: improve or fall behind. That pressure encourages progress. Without competition, businesses may become complacent. Why innovate if customers have no alternatives? Why lower prices if competition is blocked? Why improve efficiency if government protection guarantees profits? Smith believed competition was one of the most powerful forces driving economic improvement. The consumer gets forgotten. One thing that makes Smith's analysis feel modern is that he constantly focuses on consumers. Governments often talk about protecting industries, businesses talk about protecting profits, politicians talk about protecting jobs. Smith asks, what about the consumer? After all, every producer is also a consumer. Every worker buys goods and services. Every family benefits from lower prices and greater choice. Trade restrictions often protect certain producers while making life more expensive for everyone else. The people paying higher prices rarely receive the same attention as the industries receiving protection. Smith wanted readers to remember that consumers matter too. Why specialization matters again. This argument connects directly to ideas from Book 1. Remember the division of labor? Specialization increases productivity. The same principle applies internationally. Different countries often specialize in different things. Some excel at manufacturing, some excel at agriculture, some excel at technology, some excel at natural resources. When countries specialize and trade, total production can increase. Everyone gains access to goods that would be more expensive or difficult to produce domestically. Trade allows societies to benefit from each other's strengths. Restricting trade limits those benefits. Smith wasn't completely dogmatic. One thing often overlooked is that Smith was not arguing for absolute free trade under every circumstance. He recognized exceptions sometimes exist. National security concerns, for example. Certain strategic industries may have special importance, but his general principle remained clear. Trade restrictions require strong justification. The burden of proof should be on those who want to interfere with voluntary exchange, because intervention often creates unintended consequences. Why this debate never ends. What makes Book 4 fascinating is how relevant it still feels. Today, we hear debates about tariffs, trade deficits, manufacturing jobs, globalization, supply chains, economic nationalism. The countries have changed, the products have changed, the technologies have changed, but the arguments sound remarkably familiar. Some people emphasize protection, others emphasize openness. Some fear foreign competition, others see trade as an opportunity. Smith would recognize the debate immediately. The hidden cost of protection. One of Smith's deepest insights is that protection often hides costs. The benefits are visible. A protected factory stays open. A specific industry receives support. Jobs are preserved. Those effects are easy to see. The costs are harder to notice. Millions of consumers paying slightly higher prices, businesses facing higher input costs, innovation slowing, resources remaining trapped in less efficient activities. These effects are spread throughout the economy. Because they're less visible, they're often ignored. Smith wanted people to look beyond the obvious and consider the full economic picture. The bigger lesson. Adam Smith's argument wasn't that every import is good or every tariff is bad. His larger point was about economic freedom. When people are free to buy and sell voluntarily, markets often discover more efficient outcomes than governments expect. Trade allows specialization. Specialization increases productivity. Productivity creates wealth. Restricting trade may protect certain interests, but it can also reduce the overall prosperity of society. And once Smith starts defending the power of voluntary exchange, he arrives at one of the most famous ideas ever written in economics, an idea that has become synonymous with his name, a concept so influential that people still discuss it nearly 250 years later. An idea that has become synonymous with his name, a concept so influential that people still discuss it nearly 250 years later. The invisible hand. If there is one phrase that made Adam Smith famous, it's this: the invisible hand. Even people who have never read The Wealth of Nations have heard the term. Politicians quote it, economists debate it, business leaders reference it, students learn about it. But here's the funny thing. Most people know the phrase. Very few people understand what Smith was actually talking about. The invisible hand is often treated like a magical force that makes everything work perfectly. That's not what Adam Smith meant. In fact, his idea was much simpler and much more powerful. A simple observation. Imagine a baker waking up at 5 in the morning. He starts mixing dough, he turns on the ovens, he prepares bread for customers. Why is he doing it? Is he trying to solve world hunger? No. Is he sacrificing for society? No. Is he thinking about improving the economy? Probably not. He's trying to earn a living. He wants to support himself and his family. Now think about the result. Because he wants income, people have fresh bread. Customers get food, workers receive wages, suppliers sell ingredients. The local economy benefits. The baker pursued his own interests, yet his actions helped many other people. This simple observation sits at the heart of Smith's argument. Self-interest isn't the same as selfishness. One of the biggest misunderstandings about Adam Smith is the idea that he believed greed is good. That's not what he said. Smith understood that people naturally pursue their own interests. You work because you want income. You start a business because you want profit. You study because you want opportunities. You save money because you want security. These motivations are normal. They don't automatically make someone selfish or amoral. Smith's insight was that markets can channel self-interest into productive outcomes. In order to make money, businesses usually have to provide something people actually want. If they don't create value, customers leave. That's a powerful form of discipline. Why businesses serve customers. Think about how a business survives. A restaurant must attract diners. A clothing company must attract buyers. A software company must attract users. A car manufacturer must attract drivers. No matter how much a business wants profit, it usually earns profit by satisfying customers. This creates an interesting situation. The business is pursuing its own goals. The customer is pursuing their own goals, yet both sides benefit. The transaction happens because each party believes they're getting something valuable. Neither side needs to be forced. That's voluntary exchange, and Smith believed voluntary exchange was one of the greatest wealth-creating forces in human history. The invisible coordination. Now imagine millions of people making decisions every day. Consumers buying products, businesses investing money, workers changing jobs, farmers growing crops, manufacturers producing goods, investors funding new projects. Nobody is controlling the entire system. No central planner directs every decision. No government office determines exactly how many shoes should be produced or how many loaves of bread should be baked. Yet somehow goods appear in stores, food arrives in supermarkets, packages reach customers, services become available. The economy coordinates itself through countless individual decisions. This is the phenomenon Smith was trying to describe. The price system does the talking. How does this coordination happen? Through prices. Imagine coffee suddenly becomes more popular. Demand increases. Coffee prices rise. Higher prices signal opportunity. Farmers respond by planting more coffee. Businesses expand distribution. Investors finance production. Over time, supply increases. No one needs to command the process. The price system communicates information automatically. Prices tell producers what people want. Prices tell consumers what goods are scarce. Prices help coordinate economic activity across society. This is one reason Smith admired markets. They allow millions of individuals to cooperate without needing direct instructions. Why central planning struggles. Smith lived long before modern computers, long before big data, long before artificial intelligence, yet he understood something important. Knowledge is spread throughout society. No single person knows everything. No government official can perfectly understand every consumer preference. No planner can accurately predict every market condition. People on the ground often possess information that central authorities simply don't have. Consumers know what they want. Businesses know their costs. Workers know their skills. Investors know their opportunities. Markets allow this decentralized knowledge to influence decisions. That's one reason Smith admired markets. They allow millions of individuals to cooperate without needing direct instructions. The invisible hand is not magic. This is where many people misunderstand Smith. The invisible hand is not a mystical force. It's not a guarantee that markets are always perfect. It's not proof that businesses never make mistakes. It's not evidence that every economic outcome is fair. Smith understood that markets can experience problems. Businesses can fail, people can act dishonestly, monopolies can emerge. Governments still have important roles to play. The invisible hand simply describes a tendency. When people engage in voluntary exchange, their pursuit of self-interest often produces broader social benefits. Not always, but often. Why this idea was revolutionary. In Smith's time, many people assumed economic order required extensive government direction. Leaders believed prosperity came from controlling trade, managing industries, and accumulating wealth through political power. Smith challenged that assumption. He argued that ordinary individuals making voluntary decisions could often organize economic activity more effectively than governments expected. That was a radical idea in 1776, and it remains controversial today. The modern world runs on this principle. Look around at the modern world. Millions of products, global supply chains, online marketplaces, restaurants, factories, technology companies, retail stores, investments, services. No single person coordinates all of it, yet goods and services continue moving around the world every day. The system isn't perfect, but it demonstrates the power of decentralized decision-making. People pursuing their own goals create outcomes that benefit countless others. That's the invisible hand in action. The bigger lesson. Adam Smith's invisible hand is really not a story about greed. It's a story about cooperation, not planned cooperation, voluntary cooperation. People trading because both sides expect to benefit, businesses competing for customers, workers seeking better opportunities, investors searching for productive uses of capital. These individual decisions create patterns that no single person intended, and often those patterns generate prosperity. But Smith wasn't naive. He knew markets could be distorted. He knew powerful interests could manipulate the system. And that realization leads directly into his next target. Because if competition helps markets work, what happens when competition disappears? What happens when a few powerful companies gain control? What happens when businesses stop competing and start dominating? That's the question Adam Smith tackles next. Why monopolies are dangerous. Imagine you're hungry and want to buy food, but there's only one grocery store in town. One. No competitors, no alternatives, no other options. If the store raises prices, what can you do? Pay. If the quality drops, what can you do? Accept it. If customer service becomes terrible, where else can you go? Nowhere. The store knows this, and that's exactly why monopolies worry economists, including Adam Smith. In Book 4 of The Wealth of Nations, Smith spends a surprising amount of time criticizing monopolies. Why? Because many of the same governments that claim to support national prosperity were actively creating monopolies. They granted special privileges, protected favored businesses, restricted competition, and according to Smith, these policies often benefited a small group while hurting everyone else. What is a monopoly? A monopoly exists when a single seller dominates a market. Instead of competing against rivals, one company controls most or all of the supply. That control creates power, and power changes behavior. Think about competition for a moment. When businesses compete, they have to earn customers. They lower prices, improve products, offer better service, innovate, adapt. Because if they don't, customers leave. Competition keeps businesses sharp. A monopoly faces far less pressure, and that's where problems begin. Why competition matters. Imagine two coffee shops on the same street. Both want customers. If one shop serves bad coffee, people walk next door. If one charges ridiculous prices, customers choose the competitor. This forces both businesses to improve. Competition becomes a constant quality control system. Now imagine one coffee shop owns every location in the city. Suddenly, the incentives change. There's less pressure to innovate, less pressure to improve service, less pressure to lower prices. The company still wants profits, but it faces fewer consequences for poor performance. Smith believed competition was one of the most powerful forces driving economic progress. Without it, markets become less dynamic. The temptation of monopoly power. Here's something Smith understood very well. Most businesses love competition in theory, but many dislike it in practice. Competition forces companies to work harder, lower margins, constant improvement, relentless pressure. If given the choice, many businesses would prefer fewer competitors. Why fight for customers when you can dominate the market? Why lower prices when consumers have nowhere else to go? Why innovate when profits are already protected? This temptation exists in every era, and that's why Smith was suspicious whenever powerful businesses became too comfortable. Smith's famous warning. One of the most quoted observations in The Wealth of Nations concerns merchants and business interests. Smith famously suggested that when people from the same trade gather together, conversations often drift towards ways of reducing competition. In modern language, he's describing something simple. Businesses naturally seek advantages. Sometimes those advantages come from innovation. Sometimes they come from efficiency. But sometimes they come from limiting competition. Smith wanted governments and citizens to recognize this tendency. Because monopolies rarely announce themselves as monopolies, they often appear under more attractive labels: protection, stability, national interest, industry support, special privileges. The language changes, the incentives remain the same. Government-created monopolies. One thing that surprises many readers is that Smith wasn't only criticizing large companies, he was also criticizing governments. In his time, governments often granted monopoly rights to favored businesses. Certain companies received exclusive permission to trade in specific regions. Others gained legal protection from competitors. Some industries were heavily restricted. These arrangements were often justified as necessary for economic development. Smith disagreed. He believed competition generally creates better outcomes than exclusive privileges, because when governments choose winners, they often reduce the competitive forces that drive progress. Who pays the price? When monopolies gain power, someone usually pays the cost. Consumers. Prices rise, choices shrink, innovation slows, quality may decline. The monopoly earns higher profits, the public receives less value. This is one reason Smith constantly viewed economic questions from the consumer's perspective. Politicians often focus on producers, businesses focus on profits. Smith asks, what happens to ordinary people? After all, the purpose of economic activity is not merely to enrich producers, it's to improve living standards. If monopolies reduce consumer welfare, society becomes less prosperous overall. Why innovation slows? Think about some of the greatest innovations in history: new technologies, better products, more efficient production methods, improved services. Where do these often come from? Competition. Companies trying to outperform rivals, businesses searching for advantages, entrepreneurs challenging established players. Competition creates urgency. Monopolies often reduce that urgency. If your customers cannot leave, why rush to improve? If your profits are protected, why take risks? Innovation doesn't disappear completely, but the incentives become weaker. Smith saw this as a major economic danger. The invisible hand needs competition. Back in the previous chapter, we discussed the invisible hand, the idea that individuals pursuing their own interests can unintentionally benefit society. But there's an important detail people often miss. The invisible hand works best when competition exists. Competition channels self-interest into socially useful behavior. Businesses seeking profit must satisfy customers. They must earn loyalty. They must provide value. Monopolies weaken this mechanism. A company can pursue profit without facing the same competitive discipline. That's why Smith viewed competition as essential. It's the force that keeps self-interest aligned with public benefit. The modern relevance. It's amazing how modern Smith's arguments feel. Today, people debate the influence of giant corporations, technology platforms, media companies, retail giants, financial institutions. Questions keep appearing. Can companies become too powerful? Does market dominance reduce competition? Are consumers benefiting? Is innovation being encouraged or discouraged? These debates may involve different industries than Smith knew, but the underlying concerns are remarkably similar. Economic power still matters. Competition still matters. Consumer welfare still matters. The bigger lesson. Adam Smith was not anti-business. Far from it. He admired entrepreneurship, supported trade, defended markets, celebrated innovation. But he understood something many people forget. Markets only work well when competition exists. Without competition, power accumulates, prices rise, choices shrink, innovation slows, consumers lose. The goal isn't simply to have businesses. The goal is to have competitive markets where businesses constantly strive to serve customers better. And as Smith continues dismantling the mercantilist system, he turns his attention to another institution that governments loved: colonial empires. Because if monopolies create problems at home, what happens when entire continents are organized around monopoly and control? That's where Book 4 goes next: How Colonies Made Nations Rich and Poor. When most people think about empires, they think about power. Huge territories, powerful navies, foreign lands, massive wealth flowing back to the homeland. For centuries, European governments believed colonies were the ultimate economic asset. The logic seemed obvious. If you control more territory, you gain more resources. More resources mean more wealth. More wealth means more power. Case closed. At least, that's what many politicians believed. But in Book 4 of The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith asks a surprisingly uncomfortable question. What if colonies aren't nearly as profitable as governments think? What if empires cost more than they earn? And what if the entire colonial system is built on a misunderstanding of wealth? This was a controversial argument in Smith's time, and in many ways it still is. Why Europe loved colonies. To understand Smith's criticism, we first need to understand why colonies became so popular. Imagine you're a European king in the 1600s or 1700s. You hear stories of vast lands overseas, gold, silver, sugar, tobacco, cotton, spices, new markets, new resources. The opportunity looks enormous. Governments saw colonies as economic machines, places that could provide valuable goods while serving as captive markets for the mother country. The dream was simple: control the colony, control the trade, control the profits, become richer. This fit perfectly with mercantilist thinking. Colonies and monopoly. There's something important to understand. Most colonial systems were not based on free trade, they were based on control. Governments often required colonies to trade primarily with the home country. Certain goods could only be sold through approved channels. Specific companies received exclusive rights. Competition was restricted, trade routes were regulated. In other words, colonial systems often operated like giant monopolies. And as we learned in the previous chapter, Adam Smith was deeply suspicious of monopolies, whether they involved one company or an entire empire. The promise of easy wealth. From a distance, colonies looked incredibly profitable. Ships arrived carrying valuable goods, merchants earned fortunes, trading companies became wealthy, governments collected taxes. Success stories spread everywhere. People naturally focused on the visible gains, and that's where Smith believed many observers made a mistake, because they looked at the benefits but ignored the costs. The hidden cost of empire. Here's the question Smith asks: how much does it cost to maintain an empire? Suddenly, the picture changes. Colonies require military protection, naval fleets, government administrators, ports, infrastructure, enforcement, wars. And wars are expensive, very expensive. If rival nations challenge your colonial possessions, military spending rises. If colonies rebel, military spending rises. If trade routes require protection, military spending rises. The bill never stops growing. Smith believed many governments focused on colonial revenues while ignoring colonial expenses. Who actually gets rich? Another fascinating part of Smith's argument concerns who benefits from empire. Imagine a colonial monopoly generating large profits. Who receives those profits? Usually not everyone. Often a relatively small group benefits: large merchants, trading companies, political insiders, special interests, certain industries. Meanwhile, ordinary taxpayers may help fund the military and administrative costs required to maintain the system. This creates an important question. If a small group receives most of the benefits while society bears much of the cost, is the nation truly becoming wealthier? Smith wasn't convinced. The famous example of America. One of the most important examples in Smith's time was the relationship between Britain and its American colonies. Britain had invested enormous resources into building and defending its colonial empire, but maintaining that empire became increasingly expensive. Political tensions grew, taxes became controversial, conflicts intensified. Eventually, the colonies sought independence. This culminated in the American Revolutionary War. Smith was writing during this period, and he saw something many politicians refused to acknowledge. The costs of controlling distant territories were becoming harder and harder to justify. Wealth comes from trade, not ownership. This leads to one of Smith's most powerful insights. A nation does not necessarily need to own another territory to trade with it. Think about it. If two countries can exchange goods voluntarily, why must one control the other? Why maintain armies? Why bear administrative costs? Why manage an empire? Why not simply trade? Smith believed many governments confused ownership with economic benefit. Owning a colony was not the same as creating wealth. Trade could continue even without political control. This idea challenged centuries of imperial thinking. The market doesn't care about flags. One of the themes running throughout Book 4 is that markets often don't care about politics than governments do. Consumers want products, businesses want customers, merchants want profits. Trade happens because both sides benefit. Whether a trading partner is a colony, an ally, or an independent nation often doesn't matter as much as politicians assume. Smith believed economic relationships should be based on mutual benefit rather than political domination. That was a remarkably modern perspective. Why empires eventually struggle. History has repeatedly shown that empires face a difficult problem. As they expand, they gain new territories, but they also gain new obligations. More land to defend, more populations to govern, more conflicts to manage, more costs to absorb. Expansion creates opportunities, but it also creates burdens. Smith recognized this economic reality long before many others. He understood that bigger is not always better, especially when maintaining size becomes expensive. A radical alternative. Instead of pursuing wealth through colonies and monopolies, Smith proposed a different path: voluntary exchange, open competition, free trade, mutually beneficial commerce. Rather than controlling markets through political power, nations should focus on creating value. Rather than conquering customers, businesses should serve customers. Rather than protecting special interests, governments should encourage productive activity. This represented a completely different vision of economic prosperity. The bigger lesson. Adam Smith's criticism of colonialism wasn't primarily a moral argument, it was an economic argument. He believed many governments misunderstood where wealth actually comes from. They assumed wealth came from controlling territory. Smith argued wealth comes from production and exchange. They believed colonies created prosperity. Smith believed free trade could often achieve the same benefits at lower cost. They focused on power. Smith focused on productivity. And that distinction changes everything. As Book 4 moves towards its conclusion, Adam Smith is ready to present the alternative to mercantilism that would eventually influence economists for centuries. If monopolies are harmful, if trade restrictions are costly, if colonial control is inefficient, then what should nations do instead? His answer becomes one of the most influential ideas in economic history. Imagine two neighbors. One grows apples, the other raises chickens. The apple farmer can produce far more apples than he could ever eat. The chicken farmer has more eggs than his family needs, so they trade apples for eggs. Both families are better off. Nobody loses. Nobody gets exploited. Nobody becomes poorer. It's a simple exchange that benefits everyone involved. Now, imagine a third person walks in and says, "Stop trading. Only eat what you produce yourself. Don't depend on outsiders. Protect your own industry." Suddenly, life becomes harder for both families. They have fewer choices, lower efficiency, less prosperity. According to Adam Smith, this simple example helps explain one of the biggest economic debates in history, a debate that continues today: free trade versus economic nationalism. And in Book 4 of The Wealth of Nations, Smith makes one of the strongest arguments ever written in favor of free trade: the mercantilist view. For centuries, governments viewed international trade through the lens of competition. Countries were treated like rivals in a giant economic contest. If another nation became wealthier, that seemed like a threat. If foreign businesses sold products domestically, that seemed dangerous. If imports increased, politicians worried. This mindset naturally encouraged economic nationalism: protect domestic producers, restrict foreign competition, keep wealth at home, control trade. Many governments believed these policies would strengthen the nation. Smith believed they often achieved the opposite. Why trade exists? Smith starts with a simple question: why do people trade at all? The answer is obvious: because both sides expect to benefit. You don't buy something unless you value it more than the money you're spending. The seller doesn't accept your money unless they value it more than the product they're giving up. Both parties gain. Otherwise, the exchange never happens. Smith argued that the same principle applies between nations. Trade is cooperation, not warfare. The power of specialization. This idea connects directly to one of Smith's favorite themes: specialization. Imagine a country trying to produce everything itself: every product, every resource, every technology, every material. Would that be efficient? Probably not. Different places possess different strengths. Some regions have fertile farmland, some have skilled engineers, some have abundant natural resources, some excel at manufacturing, some excel at finance or technology. Trade allows societies to focus on what they do best and exchange for the rest. This increases total production, and higher production means greater prosperity. Why self-sufficiency sounds better than it is. Economic nationalism often sounds appealing. The idea of complete self-reliance feels strong and independent. Many people instinctively like it. But Adam Smith asks an important question: why produce something domestically if someone else can produce it better and cheaper? Imagine you're a lawyer. Could you grow all your own food? Probably. Could you make your own clothes? Maybe. Could you build your own house? Possibly. But would that be the best use of your time? Almost certainly not. You specialize in what you're good at, then trade for everything else. Countries often benefit from the same logic. The fear of foreign competition. One reason economic nationalism remains popular is fear. Foreign competition can be uncomfortable. When new competitors enter a market, some businesses struggle, some industries change, some workers face challenges. These concerns are real. Smith understood that economic change can be disruptive, but he also believed protection often creates larger long-term costs. Protecting inefficient industries may preserve existing structures, but it can also slow innovation, reduce productivity, and increase prices for everyone else. Consumers benefit from trade. Throughout Book 4, Smith repeatedly asks readers to remember consumers. Trade expands choice, trade lowers prices, trade increases availability, trade encourages quality improvements. Think about modern life: food from different continents, electronics from around the world, clothing from multiple countries, cars assembled through global supply chains. Consumers benefit enormously from access to international markets. Smith would argue that restricting trade often means denying people these benefits. The invisible hand goes global. Earlier, we discussed the invisible hand. Individuals pursuing their own interests often create broader social benefits. International trade extends this idea. Businesses seek profits, consumers seek value, investors seek opportunities, workers seek employment, countries seek growth. Through voluntary exchange, these goals can align. No global planner needs to coordinate every transaction. Markets help connect buyers and sellers across borders. The result can be greater prosperity for everyone involved. Smith's most radical claim. Perhaps the most radical thing Smith says is this: a nation's prosperity does not require another nation's poverty. That may sound obvious today, but it challenged the entire mercantilist worldview. Mercantilists saw trade as a contest. Smith saw trade as cooperation. Mercantilists believed wealth was fixed. Smith believed wealth could be created. Mercantilists focused on winning. Smith focused on producing. This shift in thinking transformed economics. What about national interests? Now, Smith was not completely naive. He recognized that governments sometimes face concerns beyond pure economics. National defense matters, security matters, strategic interests matter. A nation cannot ignore these realities, but Smith warned against using national interest as an excuse for every trade restriction. Too often, special interests hide behind patriotic language. A protected industry may claim to represent the national good, but sometimes it simply wants protection from competition. Smith encouraged people to look carefully at who benefits from economic policies. Why this debate never ends. More than 250 years later, the debate continues. Countries still argue about tariffs, governments still debate industrial policy, politicians still discuss trade deficits, businesses still lobby for protection, voters still worry about jobs. The names have changed, the technologies have changed, the arguments sound remarkably familiar. If Adam Smith walked into a modern discussion about globalization, he would recognize many of the same ideas he challenged in 1776. The real source of strength. One of Smith's deepest insights is that long-term economic strength comes from productivity, not protection, not isolation, not restricting competition. A country becomes stronger when its people become more productive, when businesses innovate, when capital is invested efficiently, when trade expands opportunities, when markets reward value creation. These forces generate sustainable prosperity. The bigger lesson. Book 4 has spent chapter after chapter dismantling the assumptions of mercantilism. Gold is not wealth. Trade is not war. Monopolies are dangerous. Colonies are expensive. Protection often creates hidden costs. And now Smith presents the alternative: free exchange, open competition, economic freedom. The idea that people and nations generally prosper when they are free to trade voluntarily. It's one of the most influential arguments ever made, and it leads directly into the final lesson of Book 4, a lesson that brings together everything Smith has been building toward: what truly makes a nation rich and why governments so often get it wrong. We've covered a lot of ground in Book 4 of The Wealth of Nations. Gold, trade, tariffs, monopolies, colonies, free markets, the invisible hand. At first, these topics may seem unrelated, but according to Adam Smith, they all point to one enormous question: what actually makes a nation rich? It sounds simple, but for centuries, governments got the answer wrong. And that's exactly why Smith wrote Book 4. Not just to criticize bad policies, but to replace them with a better understanding of wealth itself. The biggest mistake governments made. Throughout history, rulers often confused wealth with power. The bigger the empire, the richer the nation. The more gold in the treasury, the richer the nation. The more colonies controlled, the richer the nation. The more trade restrictions imposed, the stronger the economy. At least, that was the theory. Smith believed this entire mindset was flawed because it focused on controlling wealth rather than creating it. Governments became obsessed with possession. Smith focused on production. That's the difference. Wealth is created, not collected. Think about a successful business. Does it become wealthy by hiding money in a vault? Of course not. It becomes wealthy by creating value, serving customers, solving problems, producing goods and services people want. Nations work the same way. A country does not become prosperous because it owns gold. A country becomes prosperous because its people create valuable things: food, housing, technology, medicine, transportation, education, infrastructure, innovation. These are the foundations of prosperity, not treasure chests, not monopolies, not political control. Why production beats protection. One of Smith's most important arguments is that production matters more than protection. Governments often try to protect industries, protect businesses, protect markets, protect economic interests, and sometimes there are legitimate reasons to do so. But Smith warns that protection can become addictive. Once industries receive special treatment, they often want more of it. Competition becomes uncomfortable. Innovation slows. Efficiency declines. The economy becomes less dynamic. Protection may help certain groups, but long-term prosperity usually comes from productivity, not protection. The invisible hand revisited. By now, we can see why the invisible hand became such a famous idea. Smith wasn't saying markets are perfect. He wasn't saying government has no role. He wasn't saying businesses are always virtuous. His point was much simpler. When people are free to pursue productive opportunities, they often create benefits for others without intending to. The baker wants income. Customers get bread. The entrepreneur wants profit. Consumers gain useful products. The investor wants returns. Businesses receive funding. The worker wants a paycheck. Companies gain valuable skills. Millions of individual decisions combine to create economic progress. No master plan required. Why competition matters. Another lesson running through Book 4 is the importance of competition. Competition forces improvement. Competition rewards efficiency. Competition encourages innovation. Competition protects consumers. Without competition, markets can become stagnant. Monopolies gain power. Prices rise. Choices shrink. Progress slows. Smith understood that markets only work properly when businesses must compete for customers. That's why he opposed monopolies so strongly, not because he disliked business, because he loved competitive markets. Why trade creates wealth. Perhaps the most revolutionary idea in Book 4 is Smith's view of trade. For centuries, nations treated trade like war. One side wins, the other loses. Smith challenged that assumption. He argued that voluntary trade benefits both sides. Otherwise, people wouldn't engage in it. Trade allows specialization. Specialization increases productivity. Productivity increases wealth. This logic applies whether we're talking about two individuals, two companies, or two countries. The principle remains the same. Exchange creates opportunities. Why governments keep making the same mistakes. Here's the fascinating part. Many of the policies Smith criticized still exist today. Tariffs, trade restrictions, subsidies, protectionism, corporate favoritism, economic nationalism. The details have changed. The debates sound remarkably familiar. Why? Because political incentives and economic incentives are often different. Politicians frequently focus on visible benefits, a protected factory, a saved industry, a new subsidy. The costs are harder to see. Higher prices, reduced competition, slower innovation, less efficiency. Smith constantly encouraged people to look beyond appearances and examine the full picture. The wealth of nations in one sentence. If you had to summarize Book 4 in a single sentence, it might be this: a nation becomes rich by producing value, not by controlling wealth. That idea changed the world. Before Smith, many governments viewed economic success as a matter of accumulation and control. After Smith, economists increasingly focused on productivity, markets, specialization, investment, and trade. His ideas became the foundation of classical economics, and they continue influencing economic debates today. Bringing Book 4 together. Let's connect everything we've learned. Gold is not wealth. Production is wealth. Imports are not necessarily harmful. Trade often benefits both sides. Monopolies weaken competition. Competition drives progress. Colonies are expensive. Voluntary exchange is more efficient. Economic freedom encourages innovation. Productive activity creates prosperity. Every major argument in Book 4 points toward the same conclusion. Prosperity comes from allowing people to create, compete, invest, and trade, not from government attempts to micromanage economic activity. Why Book 4 is the heart of the wealth of nations. Many readers consider Book 4 the most important section of the Wealth of Nations, and it's easy to see why. This is where Adam Smith directly challenges the dominant economic beliefs of his age. This is where free market economics truly begins. This is where the invisible hand appears. This is where Smith explains why governments often misunderstand wealth. And this is where he lays the intellectual foundation for centuries of economic thought. The final lesson. At the end of Book 4, Adam Smith leaves us with a powerful idea. Nations do not become prosperous because governments collect treasure. They become prosperous because people create value, because workers produce, because businesses innovate, because investors allocate capital, because entrepreneurs take risks, because consumers make choices, because markets coordinate human effort on an enormous scale. That process isn't perfect, but according to Smith, it is far more powerful than the old mercantilist dream of wealth through control. And that's the great lesson of Book 4. The wealth of a nation comes not from what it possesses, but from what its people are free to create.